Here we are in Cardiff Business School's Postgraduate Teaching Centre. Calvin, new year, new First Minister.
Yeah, exciting times. Or at least a change as good as the rest, I suppose. We've had a fairly long period now of a path which was quite set, albeit buffeted by external forces. So we've had some quite distinctive visions of where Welsh Labour and hence, I guess, in the short, medium term, Welsh Government will go over the next few years. And those three distinctive visions now, we've got one which stands first, and we'll see how far that really is different from what's gone before.
Are you encouraged by the emphasis on the foundational economy in Mark's early statements and manifesto?
I'm encouraged by a lot of things that Mark has said. I mean, and not just in the run-up to that election, but over the longer term. Certainly, the foundational economy and the implicit focus on indigenous people and businesses. I won't say at the expense of, but in relation to kind of inward investment is something which I think myself and a number of other commentators have called for over a number of years. And there's other stuff in there as well which I think does potentially chart a different economic path, even though they may not be primarily economic issues. So, for example, transport, the M4, where he was more cautious about than certainly Vaughan about the potential impact of the M4, and on green infrastructure and green activities more generally. I think we would expect to see hopefully both a more distinctive approach and a higher profile maybe for environmental issues in economic policy than we maybe saw in the past.
And he's given a higher profile to housing, as a kind of fundamental concept, not just for housing in its own right, but in terms of what the construction industry, I suppose, can do for the economy as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's always dangerous, I think, to see housing primarily through an economic lens, which the temptation of governments in the UK is to look at housing and immediately ask, how can we make the market respond to the dysfunction within it, or how can we change the market in order to respond to those dysfunctions. It may be that carries on. It may be that we start from a position of what do the population of Wales need in terms of housing. You can walk through Cardiff now and see, I counted 8 tents on the way back from lunch today in the main streets of Cardiff. If you start from a position of how do we provide, and they go from then down the path of whether it's private, public, third sector and so on, then that's a different place to start than where maybe in London, where you see the assumption is the private house builders will be the primary movers in the housing market, and how do we encourage them to build more? So there's an opportunity there for that kind of a new form of clear red water, if you like, from London.
But we know they're not going to be the prime movers anywhere north of Cardiff.
That's right, yeah.
They were saying some time ago that they were going to cease house building north of Pontypridd, I think it was, but when I looked into where some of them were building, they hadn't been building north of Pontypridd for years.
That's right, yeah, and it's funny how housing is only one of a number of areas where the distinction between the coastal strip, if you like, and the valleys, albeit I know obviously Newport and Swansea have particular issues, Cardiff itself, but the conditions economically are so different in the valleys and on the coast that it's difficult even within a city region, where those places are in the same city region, to think about solutions which are the same for both. So if you drive past Cowbridge, you can see an extensive new housing estate going up the back of Cowbridge. The issues there are much more about managing potentially excess demand for land. The flip side of, say, Ebbw, where you've got the works, which has been open for business for many years now and hasn't attracted housing. And this is why I wrote something on this a few years ago about how it's very difficult to imagine a one-size-fits-all economic strategy for Wales directed from Cardiff, which really manages those very, very different pressures and different kinds of problems across, even within a city region, let alone different city regions.
One of the advantages, though, of the housing agenda in terms of the economy is that it does give you an opportunity to develop the skills base in Wales in a sector which can't be offshored.
Well, that's right. I mean, and back to the foundational economy, I remember a suggestion being put to a former minister about a green construction skills college, which would address this kind of this kind of issue, where you would hope to if you like, create a virtuous circle where the money that was spent on fundamental services like housing would remain in places like the valleys and rural communities as well, and they would at the same time upskill both people in those communities, but also the businesses of those communities. I mean, the idea was for something like a green kite mark, so you could only procure into the public sector if you had up-to-date sustainable construction accreditation for yourself and your workers, and then what you get hopefully is a virtuous circle where you really start to use procurement in this positive way.
And then that's some of the registered social landlords, community mutuals have been looking at that, and well, more than looking at it, implementing it, to be fair.
Yes.
We'll come on to procurement in a moment, because I suspect that will take us into, or maybe it will be a byproduct of a discussion on Brexit. But you started off by saying, well, you know, it's here we are. Is this a change? You know, after obviously it's 20 years this year of having a Welsh government, 20 years this year of having a National Assembly. One of the big questions, I think, is going to be, we've had nearly 10 years now of austerity, and we are in a series of convulsions about what will happen on Brexit. How do you see devolution withstanding those kinds of pressures as we move forward?
Well, I think it's fair to say that there's no going back in terms of a pull from the centre, from Westminster, to drag back powers necessarily, I think. I mean, I'm no political expert by any means, but it seems to me that certainly the current Conservative government realises it can easily do without Wales and Scotland electorally, probably, with a fair wind and a decent leader and so on. And I think that interest in the Celtic fringes seems to have gone down markedly in the Tory party, in London. And I think that, there seems to be certainly, as part of the Brexit and as part of the austerity kind of debate, this view of, let the devil take the Celts and they can do what they like. I mean, that within the Tory party, I think, as far as I can judge from the outside. So I think it will be a case of how we can manage. If we have a hard Brexit or a bad Brexit, you could argue any Brexit's a bad Brexit for Wales, I'd certainly argue that. If we have a bad Brexit, then the question will be how can we manage an ongoing devolution process in order to not accidentally shoot ourselves in the foot in terms of whatever comes out post-Barnett. So I mean, this issue about the taxes that are devolved, which is very important, and whether, for example, the devolution of things like stamp duty take full account of the fact that property prices in Wales don't rise as fast as they do in the rest of the UK. I mean, Jerry Holtham has written on this a bit, I think. That's very important to make sure that the devolution process doesn't leave us even more open to austerity impacts than we would be under kind of a prior process. And that's very important. I think the issue is actually more subtle than the Westminster versus Cardiff one, because what we've seen in the UK and even in Wales is a process whereby responsibility for services that have suffered most from austerity, I'm thinking things like social care, have been offloaded onto Welsh and English local governments at the same time as budgets have been cut. So the Welsh government has been, I think it's fair to say, pretty stingy with local governments over a number of budgets, in the last 10 years, as opposed to, say, health services. And therefore what you get then is responsibility but no power for local authorities who have to deal with, the people roughly sleeping in the streets. And I think that's as big a problem as the Cardiff-Westminster kind of dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Welsh government will probably say, well, it's sought to protect local authority budgets better than it's been done in England.
Well, I think that's a fair point, yeah.
But just picking up on one of the things you said, if the Conservative government, let's assume for the sake of this argument, there's not going to be a general election in the short term. If the Conservative government can do without Wales and Scotland, in practice then it doesn't really matter to them whether they keep squeezing the budgets to Wales and Scotland. We already know, that the impact of austerity since 2010 has been to cut the Welsh budget in practice in terms of what it would have been by billions.
Yeah, of course.
Alongside that, the welfare cuts have had a significant impact on incomes and spending power in deprived communities. Yeah, very much
disproportionately to Wales.
Very significant, and that may be the order of $1 billion or so in itself. Then there's the potential loss, of European funding as a result of Brexit. So those squeezes on the Welsh social wage, if you like, are going to be very significant.
Well, they will, but interestingly, I don't think this is necessarily a Welsh and even a Celtic issue in terms of the Tory view of Britain, because one of the first things, the first thing virtually that David Cameron did when he came in was abolish the regional development agencies in England and replace them with LEPs, and almost unnoticed thereby reduced the regional development budget in England from 3 to 1 billion at a stroke, because the new LEP budgets were far, far lower than the old RD budget under Labour. So I think actually the current Tory party seems to be disinterested in regions in total in the UK, except as far as they have to be, for example, in Northern Ireland now. So yes, this is an issue which I think will impact hugely on Wales, but we shouldn't forget that there are potential allies and lessons to be learned from places in the north of England as well as, Scotland's always a very invidious comparison for Wales because, as I always say, it's a country and we're not, historically, if you like, and politically. But certainly if you look at the north of England, you can see similar debates around how you manage the local economy and how you deal with the reductions in the social wage following austerity in places like Manchester, and the debates there are exactly the same as are happening in the Cardiff City region. So I think Welshness is important, but and obviously the Barnett formula is unique for us in that respect compared to English regions. But the issues I think are similar in many ways.
But many people would argue that austerity fed the Brexit agenda.
Well, that is certainly true. I've been saying to people and lying irresponsibly that I could have predicted Brexit in 1985. I was only 15 at the time, but then is when I can remember the British state almost explicitly declaring a disinterest in working class communities and people in them, and that was the start of the process, which despite some really important stuff that was done by Tony Blair's governments in the 90s and 2000s. I don't want to kind of dispute that. The core economic offer to lower skilled people, lower qualified people in poorer communities did not change. From the Thatcher years. We had the outflow of factories to the Czech Republic in '92 after the European kind of opening of the single market. True. But the outflow of China and East Asia more generally was just as important. So I always say that what's been problematic for Valleys communities and those in the north of England has been the outflow of capital, not the inflow of people, from the European Union and far beyond. So yes, austerity has made that worse and significantly worse, but I think you can trace it back far more than that.
But do you think that obviously new tax raising powers will come on stream in Wales? They've been prepared for, but can that really plug the hole that Wales is going to see in its budget?
No, absolutely no way. I mean, there will have to be some. Well, let's assume that the managing of the new post-EU kind of regional development funds, even if they are the same size in aggregate as they are now, won't advantage Wales as much as they did. The money coming to our universities, which the university would certainly argue that they have ripple effects into the rest of the economy, certainly research and student-wise. When those monies go on top of what looks like continued austerity, is again absolute change of government till the mid-20s probably, is going to be far too big a hole to fill. Now the problem you have is that the first decade of austerity, if you like, has seen not what the optimists might have hoped, a transformation of the way in which services are delivered to protect the functional kind of delivery at the same time as reducing costs. That didn't happen as far as I could see. What seemed to happen was the usual incremental slicing and cutting of services. Albeit a withdrawal from non-statutory service such as cultural provision and so on. My own town is suffering from Municipal Hall, which was given to a social enterprise 3 years ago, I think, and went bust before Christmas. Yeah. So you see this narrowing of of the scope of provision of public services, and obviously things like housing services, services to the homeless and so on has suffered, social services, and within the services that remain, not much transformation, but a kind of steady kind of cutting away of costs as far as they can within existing models. So that can't continue anymore. But we said that probably 5 years ago it did. So it'll be interesting to see where the transformation occurs.
Yeah, I'm interested in whether you think this it in itself might be dangerous for devolution, because if we go back to your earlier comment about the tendency inevitably to seek to protect the health service within the Welsh budget, the impact that then has on local authority spending, not just in social care, but as you've just pointed out, in cultural services and so on. That then sets up quite a lot of tensions. Now, Mark said he's going to keep the current local authority structure, which reduces the political tension that has been there for some time between local government and Welsh government. But it does also maintain a structure that it's probably not optimal, and there are very few people who would defend the current structure as optimal.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, the worry about that. Well, there's twofold worry about that. I mean, the first is that it's very expensive, and clearly, obviously expensive. You look at an authority like Merthyr with 60 or 70,000 people, and the idea that should be an education authority and have various competencies at that level. Is just, look at a country like New Zealand, it's a completely different ballgame in terms of the spatial scale of aggregation. So there's that issue of cost. There's another issue, I think, which is that with the launch of things like the Future Generations Act and the public service boards which go with it, you are in a position now where we might lock in that structure for a number of years. I mean, we have things like the Donaldson curriculum, the curriculum for life, successful futures emerging from Welsh Government, which is a new way of doing education, but will be delivered, as far as I can see, by existing structures.
And has come under a lot of criticism just in this week from Welsh local government and from teaching unions and others.
Yeah, because of, for a number of reasons, including the cost of implementation, the fact there isn't any money to do it. So I do worry that, I mean, I think when it was the Williams report, which was the last report, big report on local government, which may have been under your remit, I can't remember, which lots of people, including me, contributed to, and said, look, if we are going to grasp the nettle of having, fewer authorities but more kind of hyper-local democracy, this is the way one might do it. We now see a position where the top of back office kind of aggregation and sharing of services seems to died a death, or at least reduced in its visibility. So if it doesn't happen now, my suspicion is once Brexit really takes hold, nothing else will happen for at least a decade. So we're stuck with a fairly inappropriate set of structures which don't even really deliver democracy, let alone if you had really good democratic outcomes and a fairly kind of higgledy and not very efficient service delivery, you might say, well, at least we're getting people's kind of views on board. What we got now, I think, is not very good democracy, not very good service delivery.
And one day I will write my article on how not to do local government reform.
Along when I suspect.
I mean, I think there are, there are political factors in that, because clearly local government reform required agreement beyond the Labour Party if it was going to be delivered. You couldn't just deliver it on the back of one political party, but also you can argue that the trigger of doing it halfway through an assembly term was a poor one. You can argue, I suspect as well, however, that trying to do it in a time of austerity was also particularly difficult. Okay, you mentioned Brexit and what the outcomes are, and in practice, Brexit absorbs, as we know, most of the cognitive space of the Westminster government, and obviously a significant part of the workings of the Welsh government.
Yes. And
Brexit, even assuming a deal is done and there's some agreement in Westminster, and 29th of March is confirmed as, the Article 50 date and so on, Brexit in practice doesn't stop.
That's right, yeah.
There are negotiations continue for years afterwards.
Yes, they do indeed. And the frustrating thing from my perspective is the Welsh government is spending time, energy, political capital on something over which it has no control. And I think as has done a pretty bad job, not for any individual's fault, in actually using the 2 years we've had to place us better. I mean, I've said this to Mark Dreyfus, so I'm happy to say it here, that what we've done for the last 2 years is effectively repeat to the Westminster government, not a penny less. And we've done that to the exclusion of actually developing robust, nuanced policies around areas we know are going to be affected by Brexit. So for the last 2 years, we could have, rather than asking for a seat at the table and trying to protect our existing settlement financially, which we have no. I mean, there's no way that any parliament can bind its successors. Even if Theresa May said, yes, of course you can, after a general election, we could be in just as bad a place. We could, in fact, instead have been looking at land use in Wales and what that would look like post-Brexit and post-CAP, and whether we can make a more ecologically appropriate, employee-heavy, pleasant, tourist-friendly kind of landscape for Wales. We could have looked at our procurement procedures, we discussed that already, and whether we actually are able to respond to a post-Brexit procurement landscape with some really highly skilled individuals and appropriate structures. Now, I think that is starting, but it's starting very, very late. We wasted a lot of time trying to engage with audiences who aren't listening and worrying about things we can't control.
But these things are not mutually exclusive. I mean, you can develop policies for the future alongside having to negotiate, because, at the end of the day, the Welsh government started from a weaker position than Scotland. Scotland voted to remain. Wales voted slightly less than England to leave, but voted to leave. So the negotiating hand at the beginning was a difficult one. Yeah. But let's take forward then. Let's take procurement as an example. I mean, give us some of the ideas you think could be developed, and take them back to that. Maybe take that back to the foundational economy.
So the frustration here is that we're talking about things now in a kind of post-Brexit context, which we could have already been doing. So I mean, our colleague Kevin Morgan, talks all the time about the lack of procurement capacity and skilled individuals in Wales, which will remain a problem. But I mean, we had a procurement kind of round table a month or so ago, 2 months ago, and the ideas coming out of that were things like provisions for social businesses, which are perfectly allowable under EU regulations, but have not really been taken up by the UK government or regions in the UK, or nations in the UK, to the extent they have in other places. So you can set aside part of your spending for social businesses where there's a reason to do so. We talked about things like explicitly understanding there is a trade-off between large framework type agreements and small bespoke contracts, and understanding where you are best placed with different services on those. So if you're building a new road, you might want a big framework contract. If you're procuring food for school, you might want to actually procure that in very small bundles with local SMEs and so on. Particularly in Wales, and for lots of reasons which have lots to do with kind of economic history, and which are very much not easy to change. Making sure that businesses are prepared to bid for public sector contracts and understand that this is perfectly within their grasp to win. So the problem in Wales, for example, is that many public sector contracts have been part funded by the EU, which means that businesses bidding for them enter into a twilight world of bureaucracy, which they would rather sometimes not be part of, and I fully understand that. So post-Brexit, there may indeed be a potential there to kind of re-narrate to businesses and SMEs, social businesses, co-ops, that procuring into the public sector is a much easier thing than they might have imagined, and at the same time to ensure that people on the buying side are happy, for example, at pre-procurement phases, to handhold smaller businesses and have the capacity to do so. So that's all about really changing the way the public sector engaged with the private and third sectors in Wales. And I hope to see the fruits of that kind of roundtable we had coming out over the next few months, revisiting some of the good works on in the past, that can-do toolkits which have been done, which I think, with the kind of the fillip of Brexit, or the kind of push of Brexit.
I mean, can-do toolkits. I mean, there are examples that that was something I launched when I was Deputy Minister for Regeneration. And you've got other examples, I guess, of some of the road projects leading to skills investments.
Yeah, they do indeed.
And so there are examples from things that have been done before.
Yeah.
Are we poor at, rolling those examples out or explaining those examples?
There was huge disagreement on this in the meeting we had, where you had some commentators. Kevin Morgan again always says this, that the best practice is a poor traveller, and making the case we needed more knowledge sharing structures. WLJ colleagues saying we do this very well informally between ourselves, and we do learn. We don't necessarily do it formally, but there are lots of good learning kind of experiences between and across the LGA kind of actors in Wales. I think there are good examples of practice which move, but structures don't tend to change in response to that good practice. So what we tend to see is in the work we do with people like Future Generations Commissioner, if an example of good practice is easily fittable into an institutional context, it will work. If the institutional context has to change in order to make that best practice or good practice work, it'll just ignore it and find something else which is more appropriate, or maybe not, but maybe not quite as good. Now, the problem that you have when you are not upending local government, when you're not upending health boards, when you are requiring those actors that come together in public service boards with a legally set lot of objectives and kind of processes, then it's more difficult then obviously for that kind of more kind of nuanced tacit knowledge to flow and find a home, I think.
Mm-hmm. You've talked very positively about the Future Generations Act and its importance for Wales, and obviously the business school is actively involved in discussions with the Future Generations Commissioner, has invested through our public value work quite a lot of energy into that.
Indeed.
Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Well, it's an example. So in this building, just in that room there, we had a load of the Foreign Office sent a lot of future diplomats to talk to us about what Wales could offer the rest of the world. So we had representatives of business, both large and small, third sector, academics. Myself was in there, and these diplomats, future ambassadors to places around the world, asking what should we tell the rest of the world Wales can do. And of course each sector had its own little kind of suggestion about these particular businesses or this particular specialisation or these sorts of exporters. And my view there was there's only one thing which I really think is unique, and that's the Future Generations Act, or almost unique. There are places, Sweden I think, and one or two others, which are looking at similar structures or have similar structures, because it requires us to do business very, very differently. Now the issue with it is that, again, it's in many ways, it's like local government reorganisation. You wouldn't do it at a time of austerity. It's very difficult to make these big changes at a time when local authorities, health boards and others, are struggling to even deliver the services they are statutorily required to deliver. And that I think is one fundamental tension. Another is this balance between encouragement and kind of audit and the sticks and carrots, which are sort of partially with the Future Generations Office and partially with his audit office, and this makes it a very complex landscape. So I'm trying to write something on future skills, for the Commissioner, and it's really difficult to frame things in ways which are easily understandable for people who are not well versed in a particular area, and the Act requires a level of complexity, because it's an act of government and these things usually aren't optimal, which is not easy to digest. And you can imagine then you roll that out to SMEs, who understand that their public sector partners and clients may be under the auspices of the Act, and they themselves then should try and meet the spirit of the Act. And it's very hard, I know the Commissioner is trying to do this, to present a kind of an easy and understandable face to the Future Generations Act. I still think it's there's not that much that Wales does well, so we should celebrate it when we do actually something quite radical, which we don't do very often these days.
Would you, if we look ahead and just for a moment take Brexit out of the equation, though I think that's going to be very difficult to do for the next decade, what are you optimistic about? Can we really develop the economy, society, well-being of Wales for future generations at a time of austerity budgets, or does it require a return to a rebalancing of the overall economy of the UK?
We can do it, but I suspect it's going to be almost impossible without that wider rebalancing. Now, I think, and I have disagreements with lots of my kind of progressive colleagues on this issue, that some of my colleagues think that the solution for the valleys, which is the place I'm most interested in, I'm not kind of saying that rural issues, North Wales communities aren't in the same boat. The solution for the valleys is to find good jobs and get GDP per head and average wages up to where Cardiff is or something like it, and that will solve a number of problems. I kind of fundamentally disagree with that, because we know that where Cardiff is ecologically unsustainable. We cannot have cities. I mean, Cardiff, I actually drove in today, which I probably shouldn't have. I drove into work today. I do it about once a month, and I looked at my my app, and it told me there was a 21-minute delay on the A470. Okay, and that is functionally idiotic. It's killing the planet. It's destroying our well-being, and more of that sort of stuff rippling out to the valleys is just to me, an idiocy. The flip side of that is that we can only be successful by redefining what success is, and redefine success as, for example, working 4 days a week, being happy with a new phone every 3 years rather than every 6 months, maybe having one car per family, not 2 or 3, and and children not being given a new car when they're 17 or 18, which is the norm for many families, even in the valleys where I live, that they will do their best to try and find enough money for a small runabout for their 17 or 18-year-old, and then pay £2,000 a year insurance for that. If we can redefine success as not that sort of thing and other sorts of things, then you open up a whole range of options, which the foundational economy is a key part of. Again, the green foundational economy, locally provided entertainment and culture, which is very distinct and bespoke, and not spending £10-20 a month on Netflix plus Spotify plus. So yes, that's my optimistic vision of the future. My kind of optimistic.
But you said earlier on, the Muni in Pontypridd, went bust before Christmas.
Well, that's right.
So
yeah, because nobody's using it.
Well, exactly.
Yes.
So people have privatised their leisure.
Yes, they absolutely have.
And their culture.
Yeah.
In a
and
sense,
that's why I say you can't do it without.
It is Spotify.
Yeah. So and because the average Joe or the average Jane in Wales does not. Their peer group is not other Welsh people, it's the people that they see on TV, or the people that they recognise live in developed societies like them. So because we have trained, we spent 3 generations training people to be consumers, it's very hard to do an about face at a kind of regional national level like Wales and train people differently. So, whilst I have many issues with the UK Labour Party and the way they do things, it seems to me there would be much more opportunity to have a discussion around what we mean by good and success and prosperity under that sort of, what would have been called hard left. It's called, I'm not sure it's hard left compared to what was around in 82, 83, but what's called a hard left paradigm actually is really problematic in some ways from an ecological perspective, but at least it moves you over the window somewhere else, and then you can start to think about what you mean, what you are trying to do this stuff for, which we're trained not to think about under the kind of typical neoliberal capitalism.
And let's kind of try and bring this to a head, really. If you were trying to say to Mark Drakeford, okay, your agenda has been gathered under the heading 21st Century Socialism. What would you say to him has to be the obvious priorities as he develops an agenda as Welsh Labour goes towards the next Assembly elections in 2 years' time?
Well, I mean, it's. I think if the kind of the thinker that I always identify with on the left most is probably Gramsci, who knew about the importance of culture. You cannot hope to bring prosperity, happiness, well-being to a miseducated population. And again, lots of issues of Blair governments, but education is the one thing I think that if you get that right or righter, then that gives you space to talk to your emerging adults as they exit from a good education system about why we do things, how we do things. So I think that, with the best will in the world, Mark is not going to solve the ambulance crisis. He's not going to solve the crisis problem of fuel poverty. It's very difficult. These are very big things which require international, national kind of visions and changes in tax structures and the way in which we behave. But there are things where you have levers, where there's already, I've been involved in our own public value strategy, the Future Generations Commissioners work, obviously Mark's manifesto and bits of it I've seen, the Donaldson curriculum, which is now called, I think, Successful Futures. You could throw a conceptual blanket over that and call it a Welsh vision or distinctive approach to social organisation, because they're very, very similar. Now, you can argue that's not shared by some people who call themselves Welsh, but I think there's enough there to make it not rocket science to think about a concept of being Welsh, which is slightly different to being Western. That's certainly what I concentrate on. The other thing is that, which I think former Welsh governments have never been prepared to do, and that's impose costs on people and on businesses in service to a progressive vision of society. We've never really been able to say, okay, we want X, so we're going to tax Y. So we want people to get on the train. So you know what? We are going to tax Tesco's car parking spaces and car parking spaces for businesses. So I brought my car in today, right? So because I paid £29 for a month's parking at the university. Waiting list as long as your arm. That's utterly ludicrous. I don't give it up because it's £29 a month. I can afford it. I need it once a month. If those spaces were heavily taxed, then we would see behaviour change on the part of businesses, third sector organisations like ours, and people. And those are the sorts of strong messages, and it may come through the land value tax, it may come in other ways, where you have to make a progressive statement, which I think without that, then everything is just kind of window dressing, really.
Okay. So we have a public value message from Mark Drakeford.
We do, and hopefully you listen to it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Leighton.